This presentation is about what our group does. Our group is Academic IT Solutions, and this presentation is based on a series of conversations these two gentlemen had. I'm Edward O'Neill, and my boss is Ed Karras, and we're part of Yale IT Services, and in the kind of Yale nomenclature, I'm calling us Ed Squared. And the substance of the presentation is a kind of reconceptualization or conceptualization. You can really read the slide from the bottom to the top. Our main service is consulting and support, and the general category is instructional design and technology. And RE is in parens because even though these services have been given for a long time, is there really a clear conceptualization of what they are? Sometimes you just do things, you don't actually conceptualize them. And so the idea of this presentation is to give a conceptualization, but reconceptualization is the usual term, so I'm kind of using both. So I'm starting with a story about someone who comes to us for help. Typically, it's an instructor, and the instructor is in a situation that's somehow problematic. There's something negative that needs to be ameliorated or improved. Something is weak that could be made stronger. And the instructors become aware that there's room or need for improvement or some kind of growth. So the instructor is in a kind of an unsettled situation. Part of the problem is that the problem isn't really clear enough to have a solution, and that's why people come. So the instructor is ready for change, but he can't do the change by himself. He needs some kind of help. And I wanted to clarify what it means to help someone in this context. If I say help you, I help you, it doesn't mean I'm doing something instead of you. It means you're going to do something that you might not have been able to do by yourself or otherwise. So it's important to realize that the client who comes to us may not know what to change, and they may not know how to change. They may not actually end up making a change. They may just be contemplating it. They may end up making a change without us, which is perfectly fine too. They may end up making a change that's different than what we suggested, and they may end up getting help from someone else. And these are kind of moral qualifications about helping someone, that the ultimate decision and responsibility rests with the client or the instructor and not with us. So what happens next, in a sense, is very simple. We talk to them and we help them. The whole question is how? How do we actually do that? So the broadest terms we have are we're helping someone to change partly through conversations. And the conversations are integral to the process. It's not only supporting change, so the questions that I'm going to explore in what follows are these. There's what do we do? How do we do it? And that has two dimensions. How do we do it over time? And in what kinds of pieces? And the over time part suggests sequential phases. If it were a meal, it would be the courses of a meal. There'd be appetizers and entree and dessert, and of course the cheese course. And if it were the pieces or the components, it'd be, well, vegetables or fish or grains, or proteins or carbs or fat, or some kind of analytical slicing like that. And the final part is how well do we have to do it? And I'm going to imply some of that, but it's won't be addressed in detail today. So all of these things have handy noun names instead of questions. What we do is requires a definition. How we do it is a method. It has phases and elements, and the quality level refers to the standards. So the what and the how are these two parts. The big topic, helping to change through conversations. What is helping to change in conversations is the how. And those are the big things I'm going to break out. Now, change has to be defined in some way. There are three obvious models of change. Many models, but three obvious ones. The first two are much more common in IT land, adoption and change management. The third one is more central to what we do in my area, and it is from the helping professions, all the different kinds of professions that like to help people and try to help people. So even though we're not scientific psychological change agents, we can still draw on some of what's known from that area. So the main two models that we're familiar with of change in IT, there's adoption curves, and you're early or late, and people are oftentimes coming to us early, but some people come to us late, so that distinction isn't particularly helpful for us. Change management has to do with that transition. You're doing process one way, you're going to change it to another. It's true that the people who come to us are changing and we're helping them manage the change, but typically they're not doing the two things at the same time. Typically they've done the course once, they're doing it again, they're going to do it differently this time. So you don't really have a lot of the same issues. The stages of change model comes from psychology. It's typically health and lifestyle changes people are making, and my experience has been that the psychology of change is more important than the adoption curves or the change management part. In the stages of change, which is sometimes called the trans-theoretical model, because it doesn't matter what your theory of psychology is, you still go through these stages of change. There are these 5 different changes. Pre-contemplation is you're not even really thinking about changing. Contemplation is you're thinking about it. Planning is you've gotten to some actual decision making, and execution is you're doing the change, and finally the maintenance. And of course you can slide back from some of these phases to earlier phases. So the contemplation and the planning stages are usually when people come to us, they're thinking about making a change. Maybe they're already planning it and they found that there's something that they need to know. So oftentimes people who come to us are in those moments. Now the trans-theoretical model characterizes the stage of contemplation as one of ambivalence. The client is on the fence. They're thinking, should I do this? Should I not do this? Maybe I know I should, but I don't want to, or I don't know how. And so the trans-theoretical model has a technique called motivational interviewing. It's a set of techniques, and it's actually very scientific and very structured. We can just take away little pieces of it. The idea is you help people make these changes through these conversations that are fitted to the exact kind of problem they're in at their particular stage. So people come to us in the stage of contemplation, and motivational interviewing tells us that when people are in the contemplation stage, you can't tell them to change. You have to have a conversation where you help them weigh the pros and cons, identify barriers to change, and then build confidence in their ability to change. And these are partly commonsensical. They're not going to make a change unless they see that it's worth it. If you don't identify the barriers, you probably can't help them make the change. And if you don't build up their confidence in their ability to change, again, they're probably not going to do it. So even if you're not pushing for a change, if you help them do these things, you'll oftentimes help them move down the road. So what we do is help to change through conversation. The next thing I want to spell out is how does that happen over time and what kind of phases? So we've broken down what we do into 5 phases. And the grayed out ones that are 4 and 5 are grayed to suggest that you might not even get there. People come to us, we find out what the situation is. We might simply make a recommendation, and that's the end of it. We may never actually get to delivering a service because they may not need it. So the first stage is the context stage. People come to us for help. It's fairly straightforward. The discovery phase is us finding out what they want and need. Recommendations is where we suggest solutions. And as I said before, this may be the end of it. So I've drawn that little dotted line to say, we could say, here's the thing you need, take this, go and be well. If they get to the delivery stage, if they need a service, we may provide the help that they need. And one particular kind of help we provide, and again, we may not end up doing this, is we may build or customize something for them. And how you decide to do that is a whole separate area. Extensions means after you've provided people the help they need and maybe customized something or given them some kind of service, you somehow take part of what you've done and you reuse and you share it. You either publish it out, you create resource materials that are reused, or you ask the people you've helped to partner with you to evangelize for the kind of thing that you do, and to share their positive results. So those are the phases as turned back to nouns with that kind of dividing line that you may not necessarily get over, just as a little summary. Now those three terms, those three phases, the colorful ones here on the slide, I'm going to break out. Delivery a little less so, that's why it's a less colorful shade. The discovery phase, where you find out the problem, and the recommendations and the kinds of recommendations you make can be broken out into definite elements and types. The delivery phase I'm just highlighting because I will eventually say that the same types of services are really delivered in all those three phases, so they really have an underlying unity. So people come to us with problems, one problem being they can't say what the problem is. Our conversations are helping to define the problem. And the defining process typically pulls out these three dimensions. Typically, there are certain problematic conditions. What they're doing is time-consuming and effortful. It just takes up more energy than it's worth. It's either bound to an inconvenient location or a tool. I'm doing this at home at my computer, and I'd like to do it on the bus, or I'm using a laptop, and I'd rather use my phone, or whatever that happens to be. And finally, whatever the processes they're using is actually getting in the way of engagement with the material, focus on the material. We often hear, I'm spending all my time dealing with the software and not the time dealing with the students or the learning. So those are the problematic conditions. The desired solutions are kind of obvious. You're trying to save people time and effort. You're shifting the place or platform where they do the work, or you're trying to create more profound and better learning in some way. You're trying to make the tool really more transparent. So when we're defining the problem, you could say, once you define the problem, you kind of reveal the goal, that the goal and the problems are mirror images of each other, and the solution is this bridge that allows you to get from the problematic state to the goal state. So these are the problematic states and the goal states. And each of these goals has a characteristic name. Saving time and effort is just efficiency. Shifting the time or place or tool is a matter of convenience. And the last question is one of effectiveness. I have convenience labeled X shifting. You're shifting the time, you're shifting the place, you're shifting the platform. It's kind of like what the VCR did for watching television, and now mobile devices have done for almost everything. The mobile phone did it for the phone, and then the smartphone did it for everything else. Effectiveness is in bold there because obviously the most important thing is to have more and better and more profound learning. And one thing that we can't do yet is to break that out into its different elements, because that really requires more thought about the science of learning. So when people come in, we have this discovery phase where we find out what's going on, and there are really 6 elements of that. I'm going to describe them in a sequential process as if there are phases, but in fact, oftentimes you bounce back and forth amongst them, and they really are elements, even though the order I'm going to introduce them in is logical, and I've numbered them as if they were phases. First, you're identifying the reasons for coming, and that sounds like, what brings you here today? What can I help you with? What's going on? What's happening you don't like? What are you not seeing that you'd like to see? These are things your doctor, your therapist might ask you, or your golf coach, your tennis coach for that matter. What's wrong with your game? So these are the same kind of discovery questions. The second is you're trying to specify who the learners are, and you're trying to see them in a larger sequence and a larger framework. And that sounds like things like, are they students? Are they our students? Are they somewhere else? Are they enrolled in courses, or is this a non-course activity? Are they grad or undergrad? Where are they? Are they inside a discipline, or are they in these courses where they do things like writing and math, which are in theory transdisciplinary? Are they very early in the major or late in the major? Do they have lots of background knowledge or very little? Do they have lots of experience but no formal knowledge, or vice versa? And we ask all these questions because learning skills that carry across disciplines is very different than learning disciplinary knowledge. And basic disciplinary knowledge is different than advanced disciplinary knowledge, and similarly for formal and informal learning. Then we try and clarify the goals, or another element is clarifying the goals. And that sounds like, what are you trying to accomplish? And this goes to these different levels. There's what do you want to happen for the learner, for the instructor? What does the department want to happen? What does the college want to happen? What do you want to happen during the course and after the course and after the student graduates? And you really need all those trajectories and timelines in order to get the best result. If you only accomplish a very short-term goal, it's oftentimes not going to do what you want in the bigger picture. And again, you're thinking of these three things: efficiency, convenience, and effectiveness. The fourth thing you do is you need to capture the gross processes that are going to be improved. What's being done clunkily that you'd like to do more smoothly? So that sounds like, what are you doing now? What tools are you using? What is working and what isn't? If you could keep something and throw something away, what would that be? And you don't even necessarily even know what you're going to recommend yet. You just need to find these things out. What are the obstacles to change? Do people lack the skills, or are there certain habits that need to be changed? Are there resources that you would need? Fifth, identify the resources and constraints. For instance, is there electricity where the learners are? Is there internet? There could be learners out in the forest somewhere where they're not on the internet. It's important to know that. Is everyone using the same operating system and device? Sometimes they are, usually they aren't. Do you know what technologies the students use or are comfortable with? Oftentimes people really don't. What tools are already in place? If the students are already using text messages easily, then maybe you should find a way of doing things by text message. And sixth, you need to determine some kind of naturalistic evaluation criteria. Naturalistic means you're not doing it the most scientific way. You're just asking people with the basic human powers of observation in order to determine what they would see that would be evidence that learning had taken place. What would you see that would show you there had been an improvement? Is it a certain amount of time saving or effort saving? Is there something that you would see in the students that would tell you they were having a better experience? Well, I'm not having so many questions about grades. I'm having more questions about the material, is a typical one we hear. So these are the six elements, and I left a little blank above the line, the six blank elements: identify, specify, clarify, etc. And they're really kind of project-like elements. It's very much like project management. There's a situation, there's a person, which is usually the learner as the focus. There are goals to be achieved, there are processes to be changed, you have resources and constraints and success criteria. So even if what we do is like helping and like psychological work in a certain way requires a certain psychological nuance, it also has this completely practical dimension too. So how do we give the service? We give it in 5 phases. I talked about discovery, and now I'm going to talk about recommendations. Typically, there are 6 kinds of recommendations we give. The first one is we're giving people the information that they need. It's the simplest thing you can do. If they really just have a question that needs an answer, we can tell them, you have photographs to store, you have a lot of them, you like to back them up. Are they JPEGs? Yes. Well, Flickr has a terabyte of free storage, so, oh good, great. And then they leave. The second thing you can do is you can refer them elsewhere. Usually it's for a definite service. You don't just send them to someone else. You send them to someone who's actually going to solve their problem. You can also offer an existing service, and the idea is this is something you already do that is routine and standardized and in some way set up, something's called ready to serve. The fourth thing you can do, and these are in order of increasing complexity and difficulty and amount of labor. The fourth thing you can do is you can recommend they try something new and offer to support it. And usually you're going to do that because it's something you want to do as well. It's generally not a one-off. The fifth thing is they may not just need a new tool and help using it, a tool organizing images. They may need extended complex support services. There may be multiple things that they need to do. There may be multiple skills, multiple people, handoffs, testing things out. And so you could be in a situation where you're not building anything new for them. You're just really helping them implement something. And sixth is you can offer to build or configure something. And this is a project. It becomes a project with a plan and a timeline. It's going to consume resources. And so this presentation doesn't talk about how that happens. And it's in a sense, your last resort, and of course you try and do it when you want to build something that will be useful in the future. So those are the 6 types of recommendations we typically make. If we want to track our work and see how much of what we do, we can simplify it down to much simpler names. So when someone comes in, the recommendation can be to inform, it can be to refer, it can be to serve with a set service, an existing service. We can pilot a new service. We can do what we sometimes call a prosult. This is somewhere between a project and a consult. It's kind of like a consult that's bigger than a bread box. Ongoing project-like consulting and support services, but typically no building or complex configuration, or we can initiate a project. And one of the things we'd like to be able to do is to look at when people come in and we do a discovery, what percentage of these things are we doing? And one of the ideas is the more you pilot new services and do longer projects, the better documentation on these things you do, the greater likelihood you are of being able to simply give people information or give them a standing service. So those 2 phases I've talked about, discovery and recommendation, and delivery should be highlighted as well. Those 3 phases are very closely related. I've talked about those 2. I'm not going to deal with delivery in great detail, but I just want to spell out some of the underlying unities of these 3 phases. And that is discovery, recommendation, and delivery all rely on a single kind of complex service. There's this underlying set of processes I would call a complex or a master service. It's a bunch of simpler but still sophisticated subordinate services which you have to deliver in an agile fashion, doing each of them as you need. And we can break them out because then we can figure out how much of them we're doing and who can do them the most efficiently. One of the component services of our whole master service. The master service is instructional design and technology, consulting and support. And so it really has these 8 components. Instructional design is one, and that asks what is to be learned by whom and how. You could say where and other things, but that's the basic questions. One way you answer this is you figure out what is the final performance someone gives that demonstrates knowledge and how's it being evaluated. And then you have to answer the question how it's going to be acquired. How are you going to practice in order to give that performance? And usually it's through smaller, simpler performances. So once you figure out how someone will demonstrate learning and in what kind of performance and how evaluated, you can kind of backtrack and help create little smaller activities they do that lead them to it. The second service is instructional technology. That just answers the question with what tools. The tools have to be fitted to these things, the situation, the goals, the learner, the institution as a whole, the resources, a bunch of the things already mentioned. But it's a special skill picking the tool that answers these needs. Evaluation is its own other separate skill. And it answers how will measured be learning according to what kinds of standards. Are they normative? Is it on a curve? Is there a special set of criteria or a single criterion that's used? And I've added this thing about, through what or which performances, the idea being you ask students to do a series of things in order to learn, and you really don't have to grade every single thing that they do. In fact, it's quite discouraging, and I think the research shows this too. If you grade everything a student does, sometimes you can simply reward them for doing it, and then that becomes the basis for a discussion about standards and criteria. The fourth skill is this project management skill. And that is simply what should be done, in what order, by whom, what are the resources and limitations, and how are we keeping track of whether things are being done and reminding people, or as I sometimes call project management, professional grade nagging. Unlike full-scale project management, this is project management light, L-I-T-E, because the goals and the resources are already set. The goals are part of the learning. So you're not really doing all the project management pieces. You're just doing some of the simpler things. Fifth, you're doing some bit of tech support. You're helping users use the tools, and we have certain principles that help us choose the tools. If there are fewer functions, the tool is easier to use. If it's easier to use, less support is needed. So you generally try and recommend the easier tool over the complex one. And the familiar tool needs less support because it's familiar. So you oftentimes try to, all other things being equal, make these kinds of recommendations. There's a documentation part where you document what you're doing. You're creating or finding support materials because they're tools and people need some instructions on using them. It's oftentimes smarter to find them rather than write them. It saves time. And if you write them, these kinds of support materials age very rapidly. And so you'll just be writing them again in 6 months, unless the tool is so simple or familiar it doesn't need support, which is really kind of an ideal. Seventh, you might have to do some kind of research. What tools are out there? What are other people doing? Is there any scientific testing that bears on the matter? Do you really know everything that you might know about blogging tools or asset management tools or whatever they happens to be? And you might really want to do work that's grounded in research rather than just do whatever comes to mind. And then the fifth component service is development. It's usually small scale development. You're building something, it's usually a proof of concept or a pilot, maybe you're tweaking existing tools. You do need to know if it'll actually work. You can't recommend something if you haven't really kind of tried it and made it work. So you may tell someone a tool works, but until you've taken it down and kicked it around and driven around the block and kicked the tires, it's kind of a bad idea to recommend it. So those are the kind of eight component services in what we do. So any bit of consulting may lead to these, and any prosult or project can have a bunch of these, any extended support services. The first three are much more specialized. You really have to know something about these areas to do them. The last five can be done by people who are very good at that. There are people who just do tech support or just write documentation, who just research different kinds of technologies, or just do programming and build and configure things. They don't need to know everything about the learning side, and so there's a kind of an imaginary line between 3 and 4. And as you go and track your services, it's really a good idea to know which of these skills are being used, which of these services are being rendered for different projects, and even to quantify it to some degree so that you can find out, well, really, is it a lot of instructional design or a lot more project management? Because maybe we should have people to do project management, so the instructional designer, which is a very specialized thing, is not spending his time on that. We have these 5 phases. Someone comes to us, we find out their problem, help define it, we make recommendations. We may deliver services, which could be short or long, or it could be a project, and then we take what we've learned and pay it forward. And the discovery part has these elements, the reasons they're coming in, who's learning in what sequence, the goals, the processes that need to be improved, resources and constraints, and how the success will be measured. And our whole service as a whole, our complex service, has these different elements to it. We're designing the learning or helping design the learning. We're finding the tools. We're helping measure. We're making sure things move down the road and get done. We're helping people use the tools and giving them documentation. We're finding out what tools are out there and what might work best and what the research and the literature says. And we may even be developing things. And so this is the beginning again. Someone comes to us for help, and they have a problem, and we have to help them. And so I grayed out the description to emphasize the thing at the top. Someone comes to us for help, and that's what we're doing. We're helping them.